Hey guys, welcome back to Moss Fishing. Today we're back with another episode of the greatest day in bass fishing history. It's going to be episode 2, and today we're going to be talking about George Perry's world record largemouth bass caught in 1932. Hey, listen, if you're liking these videos and these stories, go ahead and rip the hook into that like button and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, because there's more coming every single week. So let's get started with today's story. First, I want to tell you about who George Perry was. George Perry was 19 or 20 years old at the time of this catch. He was a farmer, and in 1932, you know that farming was not the best profession to be into. So it's right in the middle of the Great Depression. He was a cotton farmer, and cotton prices are extremely low. And so he's doing odd jobs and running errands for people just to make like some extra pennies. And he had an old tobacco can that he would save pennies up in, and he saved up just enough pennies to buy a casting rod, and he bought one lure. That lure was a creek chub fintail shiner, and the color was called perch scale. And this lure is a wooden lure. It's about this big, and it has a metal diving lip on it. And it has, wooden fin. Actually, I think the fins are metal now, or were by that time. Originally, I guess they were rubber. They tried all different sizes or types of material, but you could imagine the hooks compared to the hooks that we have today were probably not the best. So anyway, he has this one rod and this one lure, and him and his friend Jack Page, they farm together sometimes, and at this time it had been raining a lot, and the fields were extremely muddy, so there wasn't much they could do on the farm. So they decided they're going to go fishing to try to get some meat for the table. Because back then, during the Depression, they had to get meat and food any way they could. Fishing was one of the best ways to do that. Not only was it fun, but they could get a great amount of food by having fun for a whole day. So they decided to go fishing this day, and it's June 2nd, 1932. And they decided to go to Lake Montgomery in Georgia. And Lake Montgomery it's south of Jacksonville, Georgia, about 5 miles. And it's an oxbow of the Ocmulgee River. And if you know what an oxbow is, it's actually it's an extension of the river for when the river floods, it's where the water will flow. And so it's almost like a river itself, except for at normal water levels, it's like a lake. There's no flowing water through it. So fish can come in and out of it whenever there's floods. And so this lake is completely surrounded by trees. You can't even hardly see it from the satellite images you saw. And it's only about a mile long and 400 yards wide. It's more or less a pond at this point. And so a fish this big, grew up probably in the river, and then made his way into the pond during a flood, or her way into the pond during the flood. So these guys, George and Jack, had a wooden boat that they stored at the lake just to use for fishing trips. And they headed out there this day, and they got there first thing in the morning, and it's a sunny, bright day, no wind. And you know from fishing that those are the worst days to catch fish, especially bass. You want a little bit of wind at least, or cloud cover's great, rain can be good, definitely some wind. But this thing is calm and sunny, and it's gonna be tough, and they know it. And they fish till like noon without a single bite, and they're trading off. They only have the one rod and lure, so they're trading off the rod back and forth. So George might make 10 casts, and then Jack might make 10, and so on and so forth. Well, they go several hours without a bite, and they decide to call it a day. So they start heading in, and George is just casting around as they're heading in, and he casts over to this direction, and all of a sudden he gets a strike on his lure. And he's working it in, and it comes off, but he could tell it was a nice fish, so it gave him motivation. They decided to stay a little bit longer. So they decided they'd give it a few more hours, and then so they head back out. They're casting around for a few more hours, and again, they're getting no bites. And then all of a sudden, George sees kind of a ripple over by a log, and he decides to cast the lure over there. And as soon as this lure hits the water, it's like an explosion happens underwater. And immediately line starts tearing out of his reel, and he knows he's got something giant on. And so he fights the fish for like 10 minutes, and then pretty soon he can't move it, and he's like, oh, he's got it stuck in the tree. The fish is gone. And the worst thing about it was his one and only lure was gone, if this is the case. So George isn't very happy, and all of a sudden it starts moving again. So he's like, oh, okay, this fish is still here. So he works the fish up to the boat, and this is the first time they get a look at it, and they're like blown away. And the fish dives, you know how they do when they come up by the boat, and dang near breaks his line, but he manages to keep it on. And the fish comes up again, and it dives again, and this time it wore itself out. And they were able to bring the fish up and get it in the boat, and it's just laying there flopping in the boat. Its tail's kind of knocking on the bottom of the boat, they said. And they can't believe the size of this thing. So they're totally freaked out, and they decide to head in because they've never seen a fish this big, and they decide to go into town and take this fish in. And back in these days at the old grocery stores, a lot of people would just hang out at the grocery store. They'd be sitting on the porch or wherever, just whittling wood. And so they pull up with this fish, and everybody's like blown away. And they go, you have to measure this thing. So they measure the fish, and it measures out to 32.5 inches long, which is unreal. Like, I caught a 9-pound bass, and that fish only measured 23 inches. So this fish is almost 10 inches bigger than a 9-pound bass. And then the girth of it was 28.5 inches around. And at that time, they didn't really have a world record. No one kept track of world record, especially freshwater fish. They might have for saltwater. But George had heard of a contest by Field and Stream for the biggest bass of the year that you could win some prizes. So they decided to submit this into Field and Stream for the biggest bass of the year award. And so they went to the post office nearby where there was an official scale, and they weighed the fish. And the fish weighed in at 22 pounds, 4 ounces. And they couldn't even believe it. You know, this fish is gigantic. And later on, a picture would surface of this fish, but at the time, there was no one thought that a picture had been taken. And then Field and Stream didn't require pictures. You just had to have, you know, like a witness and the measurements. So, you know, Perry later would say that he was way more excited about the amount of meat that was going to be provided to his family than he was actually excited about the size of the fish. And this fish ended up feeding his family of 6 for like 3 nights, 3 different meals. I guess it was chock full of eggs. And so Perry had sent in the measurements, and then a while later he ended up winning a $75 prize, which included a bunch of merchandise, some clothes, and he also got a shotgun and some shells, which is a pretty good prize for a big fish. And 2 years later, Field and Stream started keeping track of the world records, and they decided that Perry's catch being so large that it qualified for the record, so they put it at the top of the list, and it's stood ever since for like almost 90 years. And realistically, you know, if you caught a fish like that today, you'd probably become a millionaire with all the sponsorships and everything. Well, Perry got practically nothing. He got the $75 from Field and Stream, which wasn't even cash, it was just prizes. And then I guess Creek Chub sent him a few lures so they could use his likeness in advertising, and they weren't even really excited to do that. Nobody was obviously paying for fishermen at those days. And then there was a whiskey ad with George Perry's face on it, and he may have got some money from that, but nobody really knows. So there was some controversy around this catch, as there will be with any world record catch. Originally, there was not to be thought any picture of the fish. In 2005, 2 pictures would emerge. One actually was from Field and Stream. And that was actually the first one that came out, and it was of a man that wasn't George Perry and a young boy, of a fish that looked to be 22 pounds. And it was determined that that was actually taken outside of the post office where Perry weighed the fish, so they're thinking that was it. And then another picture emerged of actual Perry holding a giant fish, which he later stated was him. So They had the two pictures that finally came up. And then also another controversy, Jack Page, Perry's best friend, never heard of again. George never talked about him. He disappeared from the world. No one knows who or where or what he was. He's just gone. So there's no one to corroborate the story besides there were some of Perry's friends and family that had seen and eat the fish that they talked about it later. But, and you know, the other controversy is in Georgia, only one other fish that weighed just over 18 pounds has ever been caught even close to the size of this fish. And that's a 4-pound difference. If you look at states like Texas, their biggest one's an 18-pounder, but there's lots of 17s, 16s below it. California has a great chance of breaking the record, and they've had lots of 20-pound fish. But Georgia's only had one fish, and that was 18 pounds, and all of a sudden you have this 22-pound fish, which is kind of nuts. But I believe it. The last controversy is some people say it was a striper or some other fish, but now that these pictures have came up, you can see that it's definitely a largemouth bass. So George Perry, like I said, never got much fame. I believe he was an airplane mechanic, and he would deliver airplanes to different people, and he actually died in a plane crash in 1974. He crashed into a mountain in Alabama, which was a sad deal. Georgia actually erected, you've seen one of those historical monuments along the highway, one of the metal signs, they erected that next to Lake Montgomery where the fish was caught, and it tells a short story of the fish and how it was caught. And then, so this record stood up until 2009. Manuba Kirita from Japan caught a bass in Lake Biwa, 22 pounds, 5 ounces, which is technically bigger than Perry's bass, but the rules for the IFGA records state that the bass has to be, or the fish, not necessarily the bass, the fish has to be at least 2 ounces bigger to qualify for the record. So they're actually tied for the record, even though Kirita's was, just a shade bigger, at least, when he weighed it. Perry's fish was carried around in a truck all day. Who knows how good the scales were back then. So there's a good chance it could have weighed more. But it's a pretty cool story. And definitely, I think, one of the greatest days in bass fishing history. It would have been awesome if George could have lived longer to when bass fishing became more popular, that he could have helped tell the story better. But because BASS, like I told in the last thing, had just been formed in the late 1960s, so Perry died shortly after that, so we never really got to hear more about it. He actually won. There was the Field and Stream prize kept going for years. 2 years later, he won the prize for the biggest bass in Georgia, and he had a 13-pounder, which is crazy. Most people dream of catching 1 over 10, and this guy's got the world record, then he's got this 13-pounder. And so it's pretty cool. Some people can just catch fish, and it doesn't matter what they do. So, yeah, so that's the story of the world record largemouth bass that currently stands. You guys have heard of Dottie, the bass that's caught in California. That one we'll do a story on eventually. That's a pretty cool story. And I'll do one on the Japanese bass. If you guys are liking this content, like I said, set the hook right into that like button and give us a follow. And I'm going to keep them coming. We've got a lot of good ideas coming up. If you guys have any awesome fishing stories or greatest day in bass fishing history stories, comment below and tell me what it is, or message me, and I will get to you and see if we can do a story on that. Also, check out my Instagram. It's M2 Fishing, and then on Facebook I'm also M2 Fishing. So you can find me at Grant Marsh on Facebook as well. Got a lot of great fishing content, and we'll try to keep it coming for you. And I want to thank you guys for checking it out. Another greatest day in bass fishing history, and we'll see you soon.